Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Romina Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I'm great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. So there are two hot issues that have been big in Sacramento these days. And one is this new proposal from power companies to charge electricity rates based on income. And gosh, that sounds like we're closer and closer to Marxism and what Marx said, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And all I can think of is I live by myself. I hardly use any electricity. But you know what, Tim? This is just going to make me want to keep the lights on.
Well, I live here in Sacramento and we have a municipal utility, SMUD, and they already charge outrageous electricity rates, even especially in the summer months where, we have 3 tiers of some of the highest rates in the summer months. And so, if you might think about running the dishwasher in the evening after dinner or running the washing machine when you get home from work, well, I don't ever do that because they're literally the highest rates are from 5 to 8 p.m. So I do all my chores like that on the weekend because Saturday and Sunday have the lowest rates, thankfully. And so I can only imagine, if we have a proposal like this, what my electricity bill could be, especially based on income. Now, to be fair, it's going to be kind of a bifurcated system, where you'd have a part of it would be a flat fee based on your income and part of it would be based on your usage. I have a real concern about privacy. I don't feel the need to give my household income information to any of these entities. They're not the government. They're the electric company. They don't have any right to have this information unless they subpoena me and a judge orders it. So I think there are real privacy concerns about this bill. Nobody has any business knowing that information just to have power in your house. So I think there are real problems with this approach. But, again, with our obsession of everything being about, quote, equity, what do you expect? These are the kind of policies that you're going to get. And in the end, it's the working class that are going to get hurt the most.
It's classic progressivism. If they really wanted to lower electricity prices for low income and the middle class, what they really need to do is stop overregulating the electricity market and these crazy mandates on wind and power, which is driving electricity prices high and also makes our electricity unreliable. They really have to roll up their sleeves and deregulate these markets, because that's really the only way they're going to provide cheap and efficient electricity to Californians. That's
right. Well, another hot issue that was happening recently in Sacramento was this bill by Aisha Wahab, who's a new senator from the Fremont Hayward area. And she had a proposal that would ban the ability of staff to leave the legislature and join a lobbying firm or join an interest in any kind of public policy lobbying way for 2 years after leaving the legislature. And what's ironic about that bill is legislators have a prohibition like that on the books, but they only have to sit out 1 year. So it begs the question, should legislative staff really have to sit out 2 years in order to, get a job in something that is actually their vocation, that they're something that they are uniquely trained to do? The interesting dynamic with this bill is that for our listeners who've been following it, there have been a lot of issues of governance in the legislature in recent years. We had the Me Too movement really started not with Harvey Weinstein. It started in Sacramento in the legislature. Several members of the legislature were forced to resign because of serious allegations of sexual harassment. And the legislature has not done a good job in formulating anti-sexual harassment, anti-discrimination policies, and certainly the aftermath has been less than desired as well. So the leaders of they called the We Said Enough movement, stood up and testified on this bill and said this bill would have the practical effect of, if you are a staff member who is being bullied or harassed or targeted in some way and are in an uncomfortable working environment, it almost would act like indentured servitude, kind of forcing you to stay in this job, because really what's the alternative? You couldn't leave and get a job in your vocation. You'd have to go, I guess, work at Staples or get some other unrelated job in a field that you have no experience and haven't been trained. So I thought it was very interesting that, there was a real backlash on that bill. We will see what happens as it goes forward. I feel like this would have a very tough time of becoming law. I think it's certainly valid to have a discussion of, should there be a timeout rule? Should it extend to staff? What should it be? But it's certainly, if you read Twitter from what current and former staff had to say, there are a lot of real problems with that bill, and that senator did not make herself any fans.
Well, I kind of sympathize with this idea of having a revolving door in government. People go in and out lobbying or going into the legislature. And I can see why she'd want to curtail that. But to put someone out of a job for 2 years, as you say, in their chosen profession really hurts their career prospects. Can you imagine being out in technology or even in politics or in any other profession for 2 years? That takes you out of, your connections, puts you behind the issues. This is a real career problem. And I think there's got to be a good balance for this.
And if you were one of those, if you have a bad boss, there's that movie, Horrible Bosses. Well, I worked in the legislature for nearly 20 years. And unfortunately, during that time, I had some not so great bosses. Imagine if you really find yourself stuck in that environment because you can't get a job in your vocation outside the building for 2 years. So there's a lot to think through, and hopefully this is kind of slowed down and we really do think through what's the best way forward here.
So I wanted to introduce our next gala speaker in Southern California, Art Laffer. And as many of you know, he popularized the Laffer curve, and he was an economic advisor to President Ronald Reagan, as well as Donald Trump. So listeners know who've been to our gala featuring Art Laffer in the past, and as listeners know, he's a terrific speaker, charming, witty, funny, and we think it's going to be a great evening. So please join us. It's May 11th at the Costa Mesa Westin in Orange County.
So this week on our podcast, we have Bartlett Cleland, who you've heard from before and who is our senior fellow in tech and innovation. And we break down a lot of the really hot issues in technology policy, both at the state and federal level. We talk about TikTok. We talk about ChatGPT and AI. We talk about the new California privacy laws where we just learned the regulations, and that law is going to be implemented later this year. And then we talk about other efforts in the California legislature to deal with some of the ills of social media. So if you are interested in tech policy, this is your episode. We really do a deep dive on these issues. So I think you'll enjoy it. Well, Bartlett, we're so happy to have you back on once again to discuss all the latest in these debates we're having in California and Washington over tech policy. And not surprisingly, we've been having a lot of hot issues over tech being debated in recent weeks. So let's start with, I would say, is the hottest issue, which is TikTok. Now, many Americans, of course, are concerned with the security risk that people face when they use the service, and the risk of having sensitive personal information being usurped by the communist Chinese government. But it seems like from afar, watching it doesn't seem like the Biden administration really quite knows what, if anything, to do on the issue. But of course, in Congress, they, of course, had their big show trial, their hearing on the issue featuring the CEO of TikTok. So I'm sure you were glued to the television when that hearing was happening. So maybe we could start out. You could give us kind of your overview and thoughts on how both the administration and Congress are approaching the issue. And if you have any play-by-play on that very entertaining hearing, we would also welcome that as well.
Well, first of all, thank you. I love being on these podcasts with PRI and with you personally. I don't have the play-by-play. How about the overall take? And that was that, sadly, I think once again, Congress managed to put the cart before the horse. They I'm trying to think of the kindest way to put this. There could have been a lot more research and study and thought done before they had decided, before they maybe had the CEO, but certainly before they decided to have a hearing where they were going to lay into people. There was a great deal demonstrated of the lack of understanding of the technology or the issues at play. To me, those informational hearings are so valuable for that reason. If they really believe there's a problem, and I'll just stipulate that they must think there's a problem, that you find out what's going on first. You find out a little bit about the issue. And then you start moving into this, now how do we solve it problem, and looking for solutions, as opposed to arguably attacking one of the people that could have been the most help to figuring out everything that was going on, or to discover that in fact his answers were evasive, and it turns out it didn't appear that way at all, but maybe they would have been, and they could have said, aha, see here, this is the problem we have with TikTok. So that was my take on the hearing. I thought it was pretty much exactly as you characterized, a show trial. I'm not sure it amounted to a hill of beans, other than to give some elected officials time in the spotlight. As to my take then on what they're doing, well, that's largely about what they've done. I think there are a ton of real challenges here, and I will acknowledge that I am something of a China hawk, not nearly as extreme as some people, but a lot more than others. And so it is not lost on me that there could be something going on, and that China seems to have a very long history going way back, well before they're spying on the U.S. of this kind of information collecting and spying in various ways. I guess we saw another example with the hot air balloons. I think just last week they said, well, there's actually been many of them over time. So, okay, none of that surprises me. I think the challenge is what is worth talking about doing, and this is where I think the administration and Congress really has fallen apart. One last quick thing in this block, and that is to say, some states are acting in light of nothing really being done in DC, although maybe appropriately nothing right now. And so the example I'll use is Montana. Montana just passed legislation that bans TikTok in Montana. I think they passed that end of last week. Maybe it was the beginning of this week. The legislation is it is unenforceable, it is unconstitutional, it is riddled with challenges in the definitions. That it will accomplish anything would be amazing, other than creating more disruption, giving people a false sense of security, and frankly, deeply cynical, because it doesn't address the problem whatsoever. And I think the legislature and the attorney general know that.
So let's dive into that a little more. It seems like Congress is kind of all over the map, despite fairly universal resolve to do something. We've seen a lot of bills introduced or hinted about being introduced, and the one that seems to be getting the most play is called the Restrict Act, which has a lot of bipartisan support in the Senate. And I know there's some competing measures that have either been introduced or being talked about being put across the desk in the House. So what's your take on these legislative responses that are being kicked around?
Well, my snarky answer is that I think they put more time into, and I'm going to forget the actual name of the Restrict. For people listening, it is all caps, capital E, capital R, capital E, capital S, et cetera, et cetera. They put in more time trying to figure that out than they actually put into putting forth a proposal that I think will actually work. And here are a couple of the challenges that I see and really have to be thought through. So let's stipulate for a moment that we actually want to stop all Chinese surveillance or potential surveillance. I think we'd have to put it in that category because we don't have evidence of surveillance via TikTok. If so, we'd be in a whole different place, or at least any public evidence. And so let's stipulate that we definitely want. This has nothing to do with grandstanding. It has nothing to do with trying to get your name in the press. It has nothing to do with hating social media. In fact, it has to do with trying to stop China. Turns out that TikTok is one of dozens, hundreds of pieces of Chinese software that are available and that are on people's phones. And at least to date, I've seen nothing in particular that calls out TikTok as a particularly heinous piece of software that could do anything more or less than any of these other pieces of software. So I think that's the first challenge is if you really are solving this problem, how do you go about doing it? I'll also note that that we a little bit saw an approach to what we do or could do going back, well, I guess over a decade now. In 2012, the House Judiciary Committee released a report on Huawei and a ZTE. A cell phone, and the report, which is available, I'm sure it's still available online. I think it's still up on their website. Pretty long, but lists out the potential national security risks, and ultimately moves the FCC to petition Congress to provide monies to providers of telecommunications in the country to rip out their Huawei equipment and to replace it, and we paid for that as taxpayers. Thought that was just fine. There was the finding of bad acting or potential, and we did something to solve the problem. That doesn't seem to be what's going on in the debate now about actually solving the problem. There have been some claims under the Restrict Act, for example, it would ban the use of a VPN, and there's nothing in the bill that bans the use of the VPN. The VPN would essentially be used to get around the law. That is not. I mean, it seems to be okay where Bill of Attainder is concerned, because it doesn't just say TikTok. It actually is broader than that. But it essentially becomes a list of, and my words, enemies of the United States. And if you're on that list, then me as a U.S. citizen can't use, this is where it gets a little fuzzy, but can't use your technologies. And so that's a solution. I'm not sure that everyone's prepared for the implications of that solution, because like I said, you've got to figure out a lot of things, and especially what about all the other software, I should say, available in apps. But then number two, this has always been a software problem, and that is, what is a foreign piece of software? What is the domestic piece of software? Are we going to do it based on the company that owns the software? Or we do it based on where it was programmed? Much software is programmed around the world in a 24/7 way. They hand it off from country to country where companies have operations. And so it's really hard to know where it was, quote, manufactured, which is the legal key term here. So anyway, there's a lot to be figured out. I don't think this is a particularly serious effort because those questions aren't getting asked, but we'll see. I'm also just generally skeptical that DC pulls off much anything of this size, and I think that's states. To make a good argument for Montana, this is why states like Montana have acted, even though it's a worthless piece of legislation, and it's just one state, which doesn't do much to protect the country.
Where is Governor John Dutton when you need him? Right.
There you go.
So I think most folks would agree something needs to be done on TikTok, especially, involving these real security issues, involving China. But the question always comes down to, well, what? So in your view, how should free marketeers in Congress and across the country be kind of looking at this issue? What are some of the things that we should do, if there's anything we even can, be doing to deal with a potential national security threat on the one hand, without putting kind of undue restrictions on social media companies and companies that are engaged in necessary innovation on the other hand?
Let me think. I don't want to say that I reject your premise, because I don't. I don't know if something needs to be done on TikTok or not. And here's why. As a free market guy, there are several ideological tent poles that allow a free market to work. Primacy of contract is one of those. Free flow of information is another one of those. The freedom to enter into or extract oneself from contracts is another piece of that. All of those are part of the free market, but another piece of the free market is the rule of law. And while there's a whole lot of talk about the criminal side of rule of law and danger and whatnot, and appropriately so, physical danger, what doesn't get talked about is nearly as much as when the rule of law breaks down and we no longer think about the rule of law being important. And so skip over it on our way to bigger government. And what do I mean by this specifically? I think there needs to be some kind of proof or showing that there is a danger. Listen, I've heard the assertions. They could all be true for all I know, but I don't know, because nobody has authoritatively said, they've said, here is the potential of what could be done. They have not said anybody is doing anything. So as opposed to balloons drifting across our country, where they clearly entered our airspace and clearly violated that airspace and clearly were, from what they've reported, spying on various facilities, including military facilities, we've not heard of that about TikTok. And so unlike that 2012 study or report by the House Judiciary Committee on other, like on Huawei, or not like, it is on Huawei, we don't have that for TikTok. So much less any other Chinese software or other Chinese technologies, there's Chinese social media sites that are in Chinese. And so I'm assume that there aren't a lot of people on them in the United States, but there are some. There is e-commerce sites that are run out of China. So I think we need some, to me, to understand what's really going on, we need some proof, some showing of what's wrong, not just fear of something going on, because listen, we deal with that every day. We've absorbed that into the way we live our lives from a security standpoint. But I think we need to know, yes, here's an example of how this CEO's TikTok information proved to be useful in the way that China came in and bought a bunch of shares in the company and now is taking over one of America's public companies. I don't know, something like that. At that point, I think we're having a completely different discussion. We just don't have that. And listen, I'm not going to presuppose to know whether they find something or not. I just know that if we don't stand behind that rule of law, even when it's really hard to do it, then I'm not sure how we can ever honestly stand up for the freedom.
So another hot issue that's being debated by government officials, and fear maybe, or probably is, ruling the day on this one too, is AI, and specifically the controversy surrounding ChatGPT. Now you're seeing, school officials across the country blocking access to the service. And, of course, Congress now is toying with getting into the act with legislation. So for our listeners who may not really understand it all, and I would count myself in that category, can you break down for us exactly, well, first, what is ChatGPT and what is this controversy really all about?
So actually, it's really easy to understand ChatGPT, or at least for most people, because most of us actually interacted with its constituent parts, even if we're not aware. So ChatGPT, as its name might suggest, is at heart a chatbot. So I'm trying to think where I've used them. Banks, I've used them. I think my insurance company. Definitely booking hotels or waiting to talk to someone in other customer service applications, maybe e-commerce. You often have this little pop-up box right on your screen, and it says, can we help you while you're waiting or whatever? It'll pop up and it'll say, hi, I am the helpful chatbot named Sally or something, and love to help you. And you type in something, and sure enough, she, big air quotes here, is helping you. Now, a bunch of those have been run on just simply identifying the words that you've typed in and then taking its best shot at a topic. So you might type in something and up will pop a screen and it says, here are some topics that might help you further. And you can click one of those and that hopefully gets you on your way to some information. It might ask you to put in various details, and it's essentially filling a database, teeing it up for a live operator to come on and pick up where that chat interaction has left off. But that's all a chatbot really is. Like I said, you've used them in a lot of places. Verbally, you've kind of used chatbots, right? When you are online, they say, please answer, are you calling about your mortgage or a new mortgage? And you say, and then it takes you down a path and off you go. So that's the chatbot. Now we've added AI, artificial intelligence, as it's called. Artificial intelligence has a really broad definition. I'm not sure there's a really crisp one definition for me to give you about artificial intelligence, but it is not natural intelligence, which would be us, but instead by computer. And so what does that mean? Well, it's constituent parts. It's really fast technology is part of it. There are tons of philosophical and religious and public policy debates in this area that I could easily commend listeners to a couple conferences a year, but literally people get together and spend hours and hours and hours trying to pull those pieces apart. So I'm going to skip over that, even though it's fascinating to people like me. But the AI now, the fascination with ChatGPT is, one, you can talk to the chatbot, and instead of being led down a word list or catching certain words you're using and trying to respond, it's trying to respond, and it is responding in a more holistic way and engaging back with you in a more natural way. These ChatGPT, this kind of a chatbot, is trained on what's called a large language model, which is to say, some people think like it's just pulling information from the internet. That's not exactly it. It's been fed a whole bunch of information. It trains on these big databases of information. Don't think database with people, and I think database of information. And then it hopefully is crafting the right answer for you. Along the line, it learns more about what you as part of a giant group of people are interested in. So if it keeps getting things wrong, theoretically that'll improve over time. And in fact, I think if ChatGPT right now is known for anything, it's that it often makes up stories or provides the wrong information. Do I think that will be forever? No, I don't. But that is kind of, to me, the humor right now. Everyone's in a twist, and so far doesn't look like this is the thing to be worried about quite yet.
So on Capitol Hill, of course, we've seen Congressman Ted Lieu gain some attention using AI to write the language of a congressional resolution. And he's pushing for, in the great tradition of Congress, to establish a commission to come up with recommendations about regulating AI, and others want to go further. So share with us your thoughts on how Congress is thinking about dipping its toe into the waters on this issue, and what should be the legislative or regulatory approach, government is taking in response to what seems like just a disruptive new innovation.
Right. And I've kind of tipped my hand to this answer, haven't I? If I were just going to answer in one word, should there be legislative, what should be the regulatory approach government takes? I would say none. I don't, in 5 years, 2 years, 10 years, will there need to be one? I don't know. Take a look at it then. This is yet another story in what is becoming all too frighteningly familiar, and this is prophylactic regulations on new technologies. And here's why it's frightening. We have no idea what the potential for AI is. There are any number of ways that it might be deployed that we haven't even thought up. And so to start applying regulations on something that, frankly, if you could find 10 legislators on Capitol Hill, thinking back to my comments about watching the TikTok hearing, who could give you any kind of rational definition of AI or describe what ChatGPT is, I'll take you out for coffee. It's just not going to happen. And so you have people who are ignorant, and I mean that in the most generous meaning of the word. They just don't know what they're talking about, and they haven't taken the time to study it. And frankly, it's complicated. I've taken time to look at it. It's still hard. I'm still trying to cram all this stuff in my head. It's not even kind of right. I don't know of any harm that has come at this point from the existence of ChatGPT, and certainly not AI more broadly, which is used in all kinds of stuff already, much less what it will be used in going forward. So I think that the notion and the talk about resolutions or commissions that that pre-established we're going to regulate are completely out of line. Certainly at best ahead of their time, and there's no positive in that. Intended in that, but absolutely well before we need to be having that conversation. First, I would say, how about getting educated? But more than that, how about we allow the technology to show what it can do? And frankly, if harm comes, then let's act quickly, which I know Congress often has trouble doing, and let's actually solve a problem, which Congress often has trouble doing. But let's bring both those things to bear at the right time, not now.
So all this discussion has really accelerated discussions about how technology will disrupt and shape the future of work in America and globally, that, we've been talking about these things for years, really. And so it's clear that as AI kind of takes hold, we're going to see functions that are done right now by human beings, they may very well be automated, displacing people out of their jobs. So in your view, how should Americans think about a future with AI? Should we be concerned here that AI is going to host this podcast sometime in the future? Or is all of this talk kind of the usual unease that we've seen throughout our history as a country, every generation when we've had the next technological revolution?
Well, what do you mean, Dave? There would never be another host of this podcast. Joke for anyone who likes sci-fi movies. No, frankly, I think probably the AI would be a better guest on your podcast than me. So we'll hope for that day to come quickly for your listeners' benefit. But here's the thing. I think should we always be thinking about changes in the national workforce? The answer is absolutely yes. Should we be particularly concerned because AI is going to displace people? Should we be worried in a way we've not concerned ourselves with in other areas? The answer is no. Why is that? Well, number one, AI already told you, AI is already embedded in all kinds of tools that we're using. In fact, there are probably plenty of listeners here who, because they love everything you and I have to say, they are taking notes on a document on their computer. And as they're typing along, the computer is guessing at the next word that they're going to type. That's AI. So is it holistically bad? No, not at all. Does it make some people's lives easier? Absolutely. Is there a good chance that some very menial tasks are going to be taken over by AI? Absolutely. Now, you can look at that one of two ways. You can take the dystopian point of view that this means people are out of work and won't have opportunities, or you can take the much more realistic point of view, which tends to be the American story about technologies being used to level up, in gamer speak, the American workforce and from individuals to the entire workforce. So you might remember that in the 90s, some in the 80s, there was a huge panic over robots. Robots were going to displace all kinds of workers, and there would be no industry, auto building industry in America. It would all go elsewhere, and it would all be done by robots. And yet we have a robust auto assembly ability in the United States, with foreign companies locating their North American plants, at least in the United States, and some producing certain types of cars, certain makes of cars here that they ship all around the world. And that's done with the use of those robots. Those are all brand new jobs. That's closer to the narrative going forward in America with innovation than this dark dystopian view of people without jobs. Will there be need for some people to be retrained? Absolutely. How that gets done, depending on the state you're in, there are state work retraining programs already. A lot of companies will retrain people. Listen, if there are places that need to be addressed, the people falling through the cracks, then we address those as we go along. Although, again, this is not the first time innovation has disrupted jobs. At some point, people stopped carrying stones and started putting them in a wheelbarrow. At some point, horses started pulling the wagon instead of the person pushing the wheelbarrow. And at some point, the horse and the people who tended those horses in the stables were retired as automobiles became more productive in moving product around. So this is not even close to the first time this has happened in human history, much less U.S. history. And I think personally, if legislators would switch from being dystopian in their view to, I'll just call it optimistic or hopeful or something in their view, and think about that world of possibilities, if they really want to do something, how about we look to do something in that vein instead of constantly trying to figure out ways to stop the forward motion of this country, of our economy, and of technology in particular.
So let's turn to California. Now, we've had some recent developments here with a law that you've been following for some time, that we've talked about many times in the past on this podcast, and that's the California Consumer Privacy Act. So the state officials who are charged with implementing the law just released the new rules and obligations that businesses are going to have to follow to comply with the law starting on July 1st. So what are going to be some of the new burdens that businesses, small and large, are going to have to deal with under the new regulations? And more importantly, which of these changes are consumers going to notice the most?
Yeah, this will, as we've talked before in you'll have the quicker reference to when we've done these podcasts on California law previously, but I think we've done at least two, and there are at least a couple pieces of writing that's up on the website about this as well. But this whole thing is honestly a mess, and we're not even to the point of seeing what the legal fallout will be and how the enforcement will go, et cetera. And that's when real people will be in a real situation, and we're going to see how much damage this actually does. So for all the people that I've heard this a lot, everything seems to be going fine. Like all you're saying is it seems to be going fine as they're building a large government apparatus to go after people who violate the law. Like I never doubted that would go fine. It's actually where the rubber hits the road where we test the vehicle, right? So we're yet to see that. But specifically to the material that will now start in July, two things jump out at me, and there are several points here, 5 or 6 or 7 things that are changing. So certainly people could debate what are the most important, but one that I find kind of fascinating because I can't wait to see how this works, because I think it's going to be a train wreck. If you are a company who has collected information, and that information about a person, you collected it legitimately under the law, you were allowed to share it under the law, you did in fact share it, and that information gets passed down the line to a couple different businesses by hook or by crook. When you get the notification that the consumer now does not want their information to be shared or collected, you have to, of course, delete it from yours, or hide it from being used, or however they're going to do this. You also have to deliver a message to those other places that may have that information now, and ask them to do the same. Whether those places are going to be in the state of California or not, that's just highly unlikely, just statistically. And how that's going to be guaranteed that the message has been delivered and the work has been done, who's liable if someone sues under the AG sues under the law of the company that's the third or fourth hand down the line. Do they even know the provenance of the original information? I just can't wait. I think it's going to be if you're into this stuff, grab your bowl of popcorn, sit back and a Diet Coke, and we'll have a good evening. The second piece that I really have a challenge getting my head around what people are thinking, other than there must be some, again, dystopian view of what technology can do. The law says that you cannot discriminate against a person if they have opted out of the data collection. Now, they carve out things like what do they call them? Like frequent flyer programs or preferred customer kind of program. Things where you might, I've got a thing at my grocery store, they scan the card, and honest to God, I don't even know what advantage it gives me. But theoretically, it generates ads for me that will send me coupons and whatnot about products that I enjoy buying, and that kind of thing. If I opt out, I guess I know I'm not getting those kind of benefits anymore if they're just offered broadly. If I'm in this like particular club, it's okay. What is interesting to me is to imagine a world where I'm trying to be a helpful, service-oriented online e-commerce store of anything. I now don't know anything about you when you enter my store. So imagine this in the analog. It's like you put a blindfold on and earplugs in my ears, and I am under the law obligated to give you the exact same kind of service that I give to someone who I know, who I have my blindfold off, I have my earplugs out. They have told me a whole bunch of stuff about them. They tell me about their family. And I can go and find, I used to sell suits when I was in graduate school. And in that exact scenario, I could walk to a certain part of the store and say, I know what you like, I know what your wife likes. Let me go find you this suit or this shirt or whatever. How am I ever going to provide that level of service to somebody I know nothing about? If you don't, you're opened up to a lawsuit. I find this fascinating. Again, grab your bowl of popcorn. This will be fun to watch to see which company gets pulled up in this first, and what in the world the AG is going to say about why they're going after a company that is just trying to market their goods as best they can under this hugely sprawling law.
So in the years since the law was approved by voters, we've seen many problems with it, and many have expressed their concern with how the new law would be implemented. But it seemed like state officials kind of from the get-go have made it clear that the state was full steam ahead. So what grade do you give state officials and how they've responded to the business concerns and crafting the new regulations? And given that this new law was so bad to begin with, was there really much of anything they could have done to put lipstick on a pig?
The easy answer is no, probably not. It is an incorrect law to its very core. And why is that? Because it doesn't allow, it frankly just locks down what people are doing or disallows, the way it is, disallows innovation. As I just explained one way. The end result is that it's consumers who are going to be hurt. And that doesn't mean that consumers might not desire or need or want some kind of protections. That's not my point. This was not well thought from the beginning. It was passed in a rush with a gun to the head of the state legislature. That starts the problems. It wasn't well fleshed out in the first place. And now you have an apparatus in place where while you can change, to your point, the lipstick, you can't really change the heart of what is going on in the legislation. And I think that is ultimately the problem. You can tweak this and tweak that. And listen, some of these tweaks probably, I'm just guessing, but I'm guessing that there have been people lobbying on some of these points, and some of these changes will help their particular industry or their particular business, and it's going to hurt others at the same time. I've just explained a couple. Some companies will be completely in the dark about what is going on. They don't even know where the information came from, and suddenly they're getting sued. These are all real problems. Back to the beginning of your question, the problem with anything full steam ahead certainly in the regulatory area, but I would say the legislative too, it's just hubris, regulatory hubris. And maybe I'm getting old, but I increasingly believe that humility serves you well in a whole lot of situations. And I think when you're wading into something that is hugely complicated, none of these issues, I love when people are like, well, this is simple. We deserve protection. Like, okay, I get it. It's simple to put that sentence together. It is not simple to figure out how we go about doing it in a way that protects everyone's rights. And I mean by that constitutional rights, the kind of the ability for them to operate lives free of extra hindrance. And then to take a highly complicated area like privacy, where there's virtually no agreement on what that means broadly, to narrow that down to something you can work with. And then the last piece is to largely proclaim that the consumers in California are protected when, so far, there's no evidence of that because the darn thing is not fully even in place and it keeps changing. And so you put all that together, and I just think it would have been much smarter just to have a little bit of humility and take it slow. No, once it's passed, right? There it is. We got to do something with it. Take it slow, do it as right as can be, and try to avoid some of these very obvious problems.
So as we close our discussion, let's look at one other hot issue here in Sacramento, which is Senate Bill 287 by Senator Nancy Skinner. And the bill would, according to her press release, hold social media companies accountable for the sale of fentanyl and ghost guns and promoting harm to kids, unquote. Now, the bill recently won its first committee approval. To share with our listeners some of the specifics of this bill, to me, it kind of sounds like another well-intended bill that isn't really enforceable. And I think it kind of begs the question, can state government really police social media in the way that Senator Skinner is proposing?
Well, I'll work backwards, and I'll start with that last piece. So theoretically, states could, and I'll now just call it the social media company. So, the state could have a force of people who essentially do what some of these sites do, and that is to force people to make a decision on whether something should be up or down. It's hugely complicated. Again, people think this is really simple, and I challenge anyone out there to stand by that after they actually learn, not what they think is going on, but when they actually know what is going on in the process of a post that you or someone else has done, about whether it stays up or comes down. And it starts with an algorithm that clearly is not perfect, because they then have people who there's a whole lot of I don't knows, says the computer. And they serve those up to people who have to look at whatever it is and decide whether it should stay up or be taken down. And of course, that's hugely open to personal interpretation of all kinds of things, from obscenity to humor to all kinds of things. And then you got a whole bunch of folks who don't know how this works, who are just screaming from the choir, saying unfair and it should be up, it should be down, you take nothing down, you should put nothing up, whatever. So you could have then a policing force that essentially did that same function. They could have an algorithm to start and then had a bunch of people behind it. And you could take that time and resource and I guess scan everything that gets put up. You would essentially be building another social media company of sorts, because it would be huge, because you'd have to be going through all of these new transactions that go up into billions and hundreds of billions of posts and comments, and sorting through them. And if you find one that you think that a prosecutor would say, listen, this is actually asking or promoting, it doesn't even use that word, but the sale of fentanyl or guns, or that whatever promoting harm to kids is. I don't even know what that means, but I do as a dad. I have no idea under the law what that means. That they would then say, listen, Mr. Prosecutor, we think we've got one here for you. So yeah, that could be. I don't know anyone who wants to live in that kind of police state, but I guess that could exist. The fundamental flaw with this approach of thinking is something that we've been dealing with for a long, long time. I've certainly dealt with it throughout my career on technology issues, and it's called intermediary liability. But it's been around a lot longer than that. So what does that mean? It means, what liability do we put on the, quote, intermediary? It's not you, it's not me, it's the platform on which we're using. So right now we're using recording devices and recording software to record this conversation. If you or I were to say something that was clearly illegal to say, I don't have any good examples, that do we go after me or you, or do we instead go after Apple or Dell, or do we go after the software we're using? I think most people of rational thinking would say, well, I don't know, if I said it, I go to jail. If you said it, you go to jail. Now just extend that to other activities, and think about things like UPS or FedEx. FedEx delivers a box to somebody, and it's filled with cocaine, and they have no reason to know what's in that box. It comes from a legitimate business. It's going to a legitimate business, whatever that even means. Does FedEx get sued? Does FedEx get, do we civil asset forfeiture the FedEx company? No, we go after the people who are involved in the actual drug deal. So what she's doing is trying to use these platforms essentially as a scapegoat. We're not going to blame the parents who are letting their kids online too much, or we're not going to blame the schools where they're allowing the kids to be online during the day. We're not going to blame the kids who are acting to buy drugs, or the adults who are selling drugs or peddle guns. We're not going to go after the pedophile who is promoting harm. Promoting harm to kids. We're going to go after the social media company that they've chosen to communicate over. That just strikes me as such a silly idea, as opposed to actually going after the harm. Now, what they'll say is, no, we're going to go after those other people too. Okay, well then, why is the intermediary part of the equation here? They've done nothing. Now, if they're involved, that's a different story. But if they have done nothing, why would we go after the intermediary? I've said to a couple of people, I could maybe before this, if every time there's a crime where someone hops on a state highway, that we can go ahead and sue the government for the crime that was committed. Well, then maybe I'd be on board. So far, I don't have any legislators that have taken me up on that notion.
And I don't know that they will be taking you up on that notion. Of course, this bill isn't the only bill related to protecting kids online. There's several other bills this session relating to stopping social media companies from targeting kids, to other related issues like using social media to sell fentanyl. So certainly all of us want to protect kids from harm or undue influence while online. So what's kind of the right approach here? And at the end of the day, Is there anything that one state can really do to protect kids in this way? And, as free marketeers, how should we address these, what might be competing interests of protecting kids yet promoting internet freedom?
I actually think, I don't want this to sound smart alecky, because that is not the intention at all. And it is my sincere belief. I've been down the road with these debates a bunch of times about online liability and online crime. In several, from Capitol Hill to state houses, proposals to legislation, commissions, and comments to agencies. And what always seems to be missing is several things, but the things that jump out at me is this notion that there's a silver bullet answer, and you kind of pluck at that with your question. I don't think there is. Listen, there are a lot of things to do. And some of the things I think about immediately before we start putting more regulations on and trying to make before we put regulations on intermediaries, and before we try to make those intermediaries into a quasi police force or a quasi government actor, I think long before that, we've got several things we can do. Okay, what is that? Number one jumps out at me all the time. How come legislators aren't stepping it up in their communities and being the educator in their districts about what parents can do to protect their kids online? There are I can't name a tech company that wouldn't be happy to discuss with the state legislator, provide them information and whatnot about all the efforts that these various social media companies or ISPs do to protect children, to empower parents and guardians to put settings on the devices or the laptops, or et cetera, so the kids don't end up in untoward places for anything. So whether that's sexual, whether that is drug related, whether that is weapons related, all that stuff, all kinds of opportunities that tech has provided that people don't talk about. They'd rather focus on the dystopian side instead of the great tools that have been provided. So I think that's one. Number two, I think law enforcement needs to step it up. And I don't understand why so many legislators let them off the hook. Now, I know we're going to hear a whole bunch of stuff from the blue line about this, and this is not a criticism of cops. This is a criticism of the system. If we want cops to police online, whatever that policing agency looks like, then we're going to have to give them the resources to do it. And if people are breaking the law online, why wouldn't we why would we be surprised there's a policing force there? So similar debates have happened. I think of when the government didn't want to allow any of us to use encryption because it would make it too hard to, in those days, crack organized crime. Well, as we all know, most organized crime has been brought down by all kinds of really obvious, stupid things they've done, not by anything as clever as actually encrypting their communication. But more than that, why not figure out how to break that encryption as opposed to asking for some regulation to stop people, good humans, from doing good stuff with encryption, for example. I do think at the end of the day, it is always a challenge to imagine that the state can bear the responsibility of actually protecting children in toto. I think that if it were perfect at that, we wouldn't have had the crisis in state orphanages that we've had years ago, the complete failure, horrible failure. We wouldn't have the crisis in our schools. I mean, good heavens, the governments can't even protect our kids in school. They can't. They want to talk politics instead of coming up with plans. I think these are obvious examples of where government, if it really is interested in protecting our children, and I mentioned one, I think, earlier when we talked, and I'm going to mention it again. If I believe, because I look at all this debate in toto about children and people online, and particularly on social media, this constant drumbeat of it's bad for you, it's bad for you, it's bad for you. Okay, I'll stipulate that it is somehow bad for you. Then one tells me more about why leaders should be stepping up and helping people understand that and show them the evidence, which frankly, it's hard to find, but because there's very little of it. But how about the states invest in doing something about the mental health of our kids, and to think about what they're doing in their state houses that might also be causing a lot of distress and concern for for kids, and not least of which is, as you take away these places for them to gather online, Gen Z very commonly says their closest relationships, their tribe, their group, where they feel safe, are in these online groups. And what is really kind of demented to me at some level, kind of twisted, is that legislators are storming into this with the very people who are there, the very people who are vulnerable. They're ignoring those, I guess because they don't vote yet, and saying, we don't care, we're taking away your safe space. That strikes me as a really bad look for any legislator or any legislature. And my hope, my prayers on all these things, that legislators reach out to places like PRI, they reach out to the tech companies, they reach out to any industries that are involved in any of these debates, get a little educated about what's going on, and then work together to get something done that actually solves a problem, doesn't just give you a press release.
Well, on that note, Bartlett, thanks so much for joining us again. It was a really interesting discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. I love doing these, so we need to do them more often.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.